Hello, everybody. Welcome to Squared Circle Calendar. On this episode, we're going to be taking a look back at October 1975 in the world of professional wrestling. See all the happenings and doings and all the, you know, and all the stuff that was going on in the real world of professional wrestling at that time. So, without no further ado, let's get started here. So, big story that happened was the second of two plane crashes that happened in 75 that would end up changing the career, that would basically end up changing the careers of all involved. I talked about the first crash that happened back in February on the February 1975 episode that it involved, of course, the passing of Bobby Shane and also um, the others who were involved in the crash who survived, manager Gary Hart, as well as wrestlers Buddy Colt and Mike McCord, aka Austin Idol. Um, on October 4th of 1975, um, a plane en route to Wilmington, North Carolina, carrying 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 wrestlers Johnny Valentine, Tim Woods, Ric Flair, and Bob Bruggers, and announcer David Crockett. The plane ran out of fuel and ended up crashing. Um, the lone fatality in the crash involved the pilot, who died 2 months after the crash from his injuries. But this plane crash would have significant impacts on all involved. Johnny Valentine, Bob Bruggers, and Ric Flair all suffered broken backs. Johnny Valentine and Bob Bruggers were forced to retire due to the broken back. Johnny Valentine, who'd been serving as a mentor to Ric Flair, um, some bone chips got lodged into his spinal column, which caused him to become paralyzed. Albeit Ric Flair broke his back and his doctors had told him that his career was over, he went through a rigorous physical therapy regimen that allowed him to come back to professional wrestling. Of course, due to this, it would alter his style of professional wrestling because prior to the crash, Ric Flair was much like the Valentines and another pro wrestler of the time, Rip Hawk. Ric Flair, early on in his career, was more muscular, would hover around the 275-pound mark and would be more of a power wrestler as opposed to the scientific wrestler we'd come to know later in his career. Um, with more of an emphasis on building stamina and endurance as opposed to muscle. Um, it ended up being a change for the better for him. Tim Woods, who suffered cracked and bruised ribs, a concussion, and a back injury himself, he was actually forced to come back before he was fully healed. Because part of the problem here was for Woods was that back in those days they really tried to stick to kayfabe. Tim Woods at the time was wrestling under a mask known as Mr. Wrestling One, and in that, of course, back then, in order to keep kayfabe or keep the storylines going, now Mr. Wrestling One was a face at the time or a good guy. All the other wrestlers on that plane were heels or bad guys at the time. So if it got out, like today, everybody would already know because with the internet. But back then, you didn't have the internet, so fans were still somewhat ignorant as to the fact of like identities like certain masked wrestlers. You know, Mr. Wrestling 1 was Mr. Wrestling 1. Nobody at the time knew that he was really Tim Wood. Just like Mr. Wrestling 2, who was wrestling down in Georgia, was Johnny Walker. Nobody knew that at the time. We know it in hindsight, um, but as such, if Tim Woods took any time off to heal from his injuries, and people would have eventually figured out that he was Mr. Wrestling 1. Um, um, so now Ric Flair, of course, as Johnny Valentine had served, had more recent months here, served as Ric Flair's mentor. Flair himself would serve as mentor to Johnny's son Greg Valentine. Everybody knows Greg from his time in the WWF as the Hammer. Greg the Hammer Valentine. Um, but Johnny and Johnny Valentine, Bob Bruggers were forced to retire due to their. Now it was said that if Bruggers had gone through like a similar physical therapy regimen that Flair did, he could theoretically come back, but he just chose not to. Bruggers was kind of at the lower end of the card. He was basically at best a mid carder. He wasn't going to be somebody. He was going to probably, at the rate he was going, he was going to probably be at the lower end of the card, meaning he was going to probably be, enhancement talent or at best a mid carder. He may get, he may have gotten his, the occasional shot at the television title in the Mid Atlantic area. These guys are, of course, all wrestling for Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling for Jim Crockett Promotions, basically the precursor to WCW. David Crockett, of course, is the younger brother of Jim Crockett Jr. and the son of Jim Crockett Sr. So, um, David Crockett would suffer dislocated shoulder and head trauma, but as it were, he was primarily an announcer, so it wasn't gonna. Obviously he came back. He would for many years be a part of the Mid Atlantic broadcast team. From '75 to in the '80s. Some of you might remember watching him on like Worldwide, with Tony Schiavone. Um, so that basically happened, and of course Johnny Valentine at the time was also the reigning Mid Atlantic version of the United States of the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship as well, champion as well. Therefore, due to him being forced to retire, he had to relinquish the title. The title would, a month later be, would be, um, would be crowned again, but yeah, so this had a pretty significant impact on the Ric Flair. They said now Ric Flair was the reigning Mid Atlantic Heavyweight Champion, but you know, and even though they said he didn't return for like 4 months. I think he still would make um, occasional appearances. Now the thing is too, though, is that the tricky thing is that obviously they try to keep the title on Flair for a while here, even though back in these days, in the regional days, um, most titles, there was a limit. You had to defend the title at least once every 30 days, usually once every month, basically. Some of them may have been a little longer, like 60 days or what have you, but you basically had to defend it fairly regularly in order to hold on to it. I think they somehow made it to where he could. But that should happen on October 4th of 1975. So, So, anyways, let's talk about some of the other things that happened in October '75 as well. We'll talk first about, of course, what happened over in Japan. Well, actually, even before we go through the regions, let's look at some of the major. Let's look at the four sets of world champions recognized by the NWA. Because at this point in time, of course, the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, was the big dog. Now, the way the NWA ran its promotion, of course, is it would have a board that would recognize the world heavyweight, world junior heavyweight, world women's, and world women's tag team champions. And all now, you've probably heard like you know many of the different territories would have like their own versions of the like world tag team champions, world the United States heavyweight champion, United States, all that. But those four titles, the world heavyweight, world junior heavyweight, world women's, and world women's tag team, were the ones that were exclusively um, recognized by the NWA board, which meant that they were not per se linked to any one territory. These titles would basically tour around, basically, meaning they'd go from territory to territory defending or what have you. Now, at this time, of course, in October '75, the reigning women's tag team champions were Donna Christanello and Tony Rhodes. Tony Rhodes was on tour in Japan with um, International Wrestling Enterprises (IWE), um, while her partner Donna Christanello was back in the northeastern United States touring with the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, the WWF, known today as the WWE. Um, Hiro Matsuda, who was the reigning NWA World Junior Heavyweight Champion, was basically going back and forth between Eastern Texas and Florida, defending the World Junior Heavyweight Championship in Eastern Texas for big time wrestling, which would later become known as World Class Championship Wrestling. Fritz von Erich's territory. Hiro Matsuda was defending the belt against the likes of um, Al Madril, a young, basically a younger Al Madril and a guy more at the beginning of his career, Rick Martel. While when he went down to Florida, he would be defending primarily against Mike Graham, who was the current, basically the current reigning Southeastern junior heavyweight champion out of Florida at the time. And then Jack Briscoe, who was the reigning NWA World Heavyweight Champion, he was kind of all over. But he started the month on the 3rd, defending the NWA World title against Rocky Johnson in St. Louis at the Kiel Auditorium on October the 3rd. Then went over and defended the belt a couple times in the Mid-Atlantic area. Then went up to the Pacific Northwest in Vancouver, where he defended against returning Donnelly O'Jonathan to that area, and I'll get into that a little bit more a little later. And then coming back down through Texas and Florida. So, Jack Briscoe throughout October was kind of all over the place. Starting in St. Louis, going to Mid-Atlantic, then going up to the Pacific Northwest in Vancouver, and then coming back down through Texas and Florida. Now, as we get into the regions, so we first head over to Japan. First off, we're going to talk a little bit about the International Wrestling Enterprises that was doing their Big Golden Series, Big Golden Touring Series. Um, and the Gaijin who were basically involved in that series, the Gaijin that were brought in included, of course, the previously mentioned Tony Rhodes, one half of the NWA World Women's Tag Team Champions, as well as Sheila Shepherd, and then there are a few like Puerto Rican wrestlers as well: Isaac Rosario, Jose Rivera, Gypsy Joe, and Benny Ramirez, who was wrestling under a mask, calling himself the Killer. These guys, of course, would get would be facing off against some of IWE's top stars. The IWE's version of the IWA World Heavyweight Champion Rusher Kamara, and the IWE's version of the World Tag Team Champions, the IWA World Tag Team Champions, the Great Kusatsu, and Mighty Inoue. Also, what was going on now as we move over to New Japan? Of course, the first half of the month they were finishing up the first Tokon series, and then at the end of the month they started up the second Tokon series. During the first Tokon series, of course, some of the Gaijin who were involved included the Hollywood Blondes, comprised of Jerry Brown and Buddy Roberts, the same Buddy Roberts that many of you would remember later as part of the Fabulous Freebirds. He would team with Jerry Brown throughout the NWA territories, at times under the tutelage of Sir Oliver Humperdinck, and they would win several. At this point in time, of course, Hollywood Blondes were feuding with combinations of Antonio Inoki, Seiji Sakaguchi, and Strong Kobayashi for the NWA North American Tag Team Champion, the New Japan version of that title, the New Japan version of the NWA North American Tag Team Championships. They had won it in LA in August, and then or I think actually it was in early September, I believe. And then towards the end of the Tokon series, Antonio Inoki and Seiji Sakaguchi would get the titles back. Aside, of course, from Hollywood Blondes, the father and son duo of Jacques Rougeau Sr. and Raymond Rougeau would also be on that tour. European wrestlers Mike Sandow and Clayton Thompson were also part of that tour. And then at the very last day of the tour, Lou Thesz was brought in to challenge Antonio Inoki for the NWF World Heavyweight Championship, with Antonio Rocca as the as a special guest referee. So by the end of the month, of course, New Japan would start their second Tokon series of 1975, and many of the Gaijin who were brought in included the Castillo brothers, Raul and Fidel from the Puerto Rican territory, Guy Mitchell under a mask as Mr. X. Guy Mitchell would later become known as Jerry Valiant in the WWE, who was the third Valiant brother at that time in '79. Bearcat Wright coming over from the Mid-America territory, and Ricky Hunter coming over from the Pacific Northwest territory, Don Owens territory. Also, European wrestler Ivan Karamazov also was participating in the second Tokon series. And then as we move on to All Japan, they were having their Giant Series tour at the time, which of course included among those who came in to be involved included Abdullah the Butcher coming over from Georgia Championship Wrestling, Stan Hansen actually making his first of several Japanese tours in his career, where he would eventually become a mainstay over there in the 80s. Bobby Jagger, now Hansen and Bobby Jaggers, were representing the Western States Territory run by the Funk Brothers. You had, as I said, Abdullah Butcher coming over from Georgia. Had Larry Zbyszko coming over from the WWF, and then you had the reigning World Wrestling Association WWA World Heavyweight Champion out of Indianapolis, Ox Baker and Prince Pullins representing the WWA, the World Wrestling Association. Abdullah the Butcher, of course, would defeat the Destroyer for the PWF United States Heavyweight Championship on the 12th. As I said, the 12th also marked the first appearance of Stan Hansen in Japan. So you had all that going on in Japan. As we move over to North America here. We move over to we go over to the Maritimes territory. Their wrestling season was winding down, because in the Maritimes, now for those of you who don't know, in Canada, the Maritimes provinces are considered New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. At this time, of course, what was going, now most wrestling promotions would run their promotions year round, but due to, of course, the harsh winters, the emphasis on hockey, and just kind of the travel issues, the Eastern Sports Association, which was the promotion based out of the Maritimes province area, wouldn't run during the late fall and winter months. They'd usually run from like I think from April through October or something like that. It basically just run throughout spring and summer, and then when things really started getting cold and hockey really started picking up, the promotion would cease operations for the winter. Most of the talent would of course go to other territories, usually in the states, to continue their work. During this time, though, during the time when Eastern Sports Association was active in '75, the primary feud was, of course, going on between Leo Burke and Bulldog Bob Brown, for both the brass knuckles title and their version of the North American heavyweight title. So basically, kind of to extend that a bit, Leo Burke, along with his brothers Rudy K and the Beast, would fend off the challenges of Bulldog Bob Brown, Lord Alfred Hayes. Yes, the same Lord Alfred Hayes who would eventually become an announcer with the World Wrestling Federation, and the Patriot. That was one of the big feuds going on. And then, as I said earlier, over in Vancouver for Northwest Promotions, of course, Don Leo Jonathan, often called the Mormon Giant, who he stood 6'6", he's like 290 pounds, would return to the area to challenge, of course, both Jack Briscoe for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship in that territory, as well as Gene Kiniski for the Vancouver version of the Pacific Coast Heavyweight title. Also, of course, very early on in his career, Keith Franks, who would later become known as Adrian Adonis, was early on in his career there. Jesse Ventura had just come over from the Central States territory to also, tour with, be in Vancouver to hone his craft there a bit for a while. The Kelly twins were challenging Dale Lewis and Siegfried Stinky for the Vancouver version of the NWA Canadian Championships at the time. So, and that's pretty much all of what was going on in Canada. Now, you know, we'll move on to the United States here in a moment. As we, continue to, we head down to the southeastern part of the United States, after, um, oh, actually, before we even get to that, um, we look to Puerto Rico first, where Tosh Togo had beaten Jose Miguel Perez for the Puerto Rican version of the NWA Puerto Rican Heavyweight Championship. And as we head to the northeast section of the country, we would see that Ivan Koloff would make his return to the WWF to try to regain the WWF World Heavyweight title from Bruno Sammartino, who he had beaten back in '71, but then lost the title to Pedro Morales. But now to rekindle that feud with, of course, Captain Lou Albano as his manager, and then Bano was also leading the WWF World Tag Team Champions, the Blackjacks at the time, who were also, fending off challenges from former tag team champions um, Dominique DeNucci and Pat Barrett, as well as fending off newer challenges like from Louis Sedon and Tony Parisi. Of course, the Grand Wizard was leading George the Animal Steel at the time, and then of course Freddie Blassie was still, his guys were still in the hunt with Spiros Arion and Waldo von Erich, as well as Baron Michael Skipluner, I believe, was also in the mix there with his team. Then, as we now head down to the southeastern part of the United States, we see that in Georgia, after Bob Orton Jr. and Dick Slater had turned face in the Macon and Columbus areas, we had seen one that Bob Backlund and Jerry Briscoe had beaten them for, or had taken the Georgia tag team titles, were the reigning champions there. Mr. Wrestling 2 had defeated Nikolai Volkov for the Georgia heavyweight title, which would then lead to Volkov teaming with Brooke Bernard in the Macon portion of the Georgia territory, and then Luke Graham and Lonnie Main would come into the Columbus, Georgia area to challenge Bob Orton Jr. and Dick Slater for the various titles that they had held. So those feuds were starting to heat up there. Then you go down into Florida, where you'd see Dusty Rhodes, who was the reigning Florida heavyweight champion, fending off the challenge of King Curtis Ayakea. Mark Lewin, who was the reigning Detroit version of the NWA United States Heavyweight Champion, was coming down to Florida to challenge Harley Race for the Florida version of the Southern Heavyweight Championship. The Negros, Cyclone, and Omar Negro, aka Omar Atlas, were the reigning Florida tag team champions, and Rocky Johnson was the reigning TV champion, fending off the challenge of Bobby Duncombe. Aside from being the reigning Florida television champion, he was also did get a shot at the NWA World Heavyweight Champion in St. Louis on October the 3rd. As we move along through the territories, we get into the Gulf Coast territory. They had, of course, retired a couple of the titles previous month. Ken Lucas was still continuing his dominance in the territory, despite the titles, a couple of titles being retired, who would be vying for a number of titles. Cowboy Bob Kelly was still dominating Mississippi. You know, you had the Wrestling Pros, and you had a tag team known as the Wrestling Pros, fending off the challenges of a team known as the British Bulldogs back then. Not the British Bulldogs most of you know. It wasn't Davy Boy Smith and Dynamite Kid. This version of the British Bulldogs was Edward Heath and John Foley, who wrestled briefly in the southeastern part of the United States. Um, you know, as we move up into Tennessee, of course, Tennessee and Kentucky, the Mid-America region, Jerry Lawler would return to the area to basically, at some point, win the Southern, the Tennessee, Alabama version of the NWA Southern Heavyweight Champion. And he would eventually chase out the Mongolian Stomper, would defeat Mongolian Stomper um, in a loser leaves town match, chasing him out of the territory. Bob Armstrong would defeat Harley Race for the Mid America title the previous month. Had the interns under the management of Ken and Ramey, who were the Southern Tag Team Champions. They had all that going on in the Mid America. I already kind of talked a little bit about the Detroit area, in which Mark Lewin was the reigning Detroit version of United States champion. A couple of well-known teams were also active in Detroit at the time. Team calling themselves the Islanders at the time, the team that would later become known as the Wild Samoans, Afa and Shika Noe. They were in Detroit at this time. Also, the Poffo family was wrestling there quite a bit as well. Angelo and his two sons, Randy and Lanny. Angelo and Lanny were teaming up quite a bit there, and Randy was still getting his feet wet. Randy Poffo, who would eventually become Randy Savage, was still very early on in his career there. Ed Wiskowski would continue his dominance in the Central States territory as the Central States heavyweight champion through the rest of the year. Ron Bass and Dutch Mantell would team up to eventually defeat the Oates brothers, Jerry and Ted, for the Central States version of the World Tag Team. As I told you earlier, there are a number of areas that had World Tag Team Champion, that had regional recognition for World Tag Team, but there was no recognition by the NWA board as such. Then as we continue down through into the Mid-South territory, the tri-state area, there's a bit of a dispute going on over the North American Heavyweight Championship. Initially, when Bill Watts had left the territory to go to Florida and Georgia territories, he had taken the North American Heavyweight title with him and was defending it. And after he left, they crowned a new North American Heavyweight Champion for the tri-state area. At this point in time, it had become, by the end of October, Killer Carl Cox had become the North American Heavyweight Championship, as well as partnering up with former champion Dick Murdoch to be the tri-state version of the United States Tag Team Champions, which would eventually lead, of course, The battle over the North American heavyweight title would eventually lead to a unification match that would bring both titles under in back into one undisputed North American heavyweight championship. As we now move over into Texas, of course, in the eastern half of the state, in the Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston areas, you had of course, as Rick Martel and Jerry Blackwell were early on in their careers, getting their feet wet. You had Jose Lothario, aka Shawn Michaels' trainer, and Al Madrill, um, basically, you know, being the top tag team as the Texas Tag Team Champions, as well as Jose Lothario being the Brass Knuckles Champion and be dominating the territory. It's a bit of a feud going on over the Texas Heavyweight Championship as Peter Maivia, aka Rocky Johnson's father-in-law, aka The Rock's grandfather, was battling John Tolos and would eventually beat John Tolos for the Texas Heavyweight Championship. While all that was going on in East Texas and West Texas, where the Funk Brothers territory was Western States, you had still using his real name of Frank Goddess, Bruiser Brody would defeat Ray Candy for the Western States Heavyweight Championship. Terry Funk was still getting notoriety as the Western States version of the International Heavyweight Championship. Would start getting some cards and stuff. Start getting a bit of a push more towards the top. That would eventually lead to his world title win in December. He would start getting pushed. We go over to the the western part of the United States in the NWA territories. Had Royal Kangaroo, in the Pacific Northwest, you had the Royal Kangaroo still as reigning as a dominant team in, as a Pacific Northwest Tag Team Champions, and Jimmy Snuka, of course, still reigning supreme as as you go down through California. In Southern California, you had Ernie Ladd, I think the big feud going on actually there was over the America's Tag Team Championship, in which reigning champions Chavo Guerrero Sr. and Raul Mata were fending off the challenge at this point of a team known for their dominance in the 70s, throughout the southwestern United States, of the Black Gordman and Great Goliath, and up in San Francisco, up in Northern California, of course, Pat Patterson was still the reigning he had gained the San Francisco version of the United States title back from Angelo Mosca, and then the Invaders were the reigning San Francisco version of the World Tag Team Champions. And that's at least what was all going on in the NWA in the States. Okay, so now with all that being said about the NWA and their territories, we're gonna take a quick peek at go back to the Midwestern United States, in which we would look at the AWA and World Wrestling, the American Wrestling Association and the World Wrestling Association, WWA, sister promotions. Of course, one of the big stories was, the dominance of the team of Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher, who had basically regained both the WWA World Tag Team Championships as well as the AWA World Tag Team Champions, having regained the WWA World Tag Team Championships from the Legionnaires of Sergeant Jacques Goulier and Private Soldat Soldat Zaragov, I believe, and then eventually defeating the Blonde Bombers, led by Bobby Heenan, Nick Bockwinkel, and Ray Stevens for the AWA World Championship. Of course, this would also open up more the possibility for them to focus Bockwinkel on pursuing AWA World Heavyweight title, which he would eventually win in November. But now, he's once again being pushed towards that title. And then, of course, in the IWA, the International Wrestling Association, which was the lone independent territory of the time, based out of Cleveland, Ohio, you would, of course, Mil Mascaris and Mongols were still dominating as the international/world heavyweight champion and the international/world tag team champions for IWA, respectively. The big feud going on was more over the North American heavyweight title with the reigning champion Bulldog Brower fending off the challenge of the Mighty Igor. Much like in the same vein as Ivan Putski, kind of a big, burly Polish powerhouse. In this case, had been involved in a feud with Bulldog Bob Brower. So with that, that's all that was going on in October of '75 in the world of professional wrestling. I hope you guys have enjoyed this stuff. Of course, we'll keep doing this stuff. Don't forget to catch me on my live stream on Monday, tomorrow from this date. As always, guys, my contact information is down in the links below. You can contact me through my Discord, or you can, leave comments here or comments on the community page. And as always, guys, if you like this content, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing. I always look forward to the conversations with you guys. And I hope I'll see you on the stream tomorrow night. And I'm still, of course, promoting I'm still promoting Vic's GoFundMe as well as Tugs Indiegogo. As always, guys, never feel like you have to donate. If it's on your heart to do so and you have the means to do so, please consider donating. If you've already donated, please consider donating again. And if you cannot donate, you can still help out the cause by sharing the link. Sharing is caring. And you never know, maybe somebody in your circle of friends may want to help. And with that, guys, I hope to see you tomorrow night on the live stream, on the Mike Stand live stream. And until then, bye.